The following program is part of a college course. These telecourses allow you to earn college credits at home. For more information, contact a college or university near you.
The animal world displays a magnificent variety of life, but while organisms vary immensely, they share many fundamental characteristics. One of the most basic of these is the simple act of breathing. Animals exchange gases with their environment in a process known as respiration. Just how animals respire is as diverse as the organisms themselves. However, the principles behind the exchange are surprisingly similar.
When we talk about respiratory gas exchange, we're usually talking about taking up oxygen and giving off carbon dioxide. And it's true whether it's an animal or a plant, it's true whether it breathes water or whether it breathes in air. That's the two gases that we're most interested in.
The amount of oxygen an animal requires to survive and the amount of carbon dioxide it must eliminate depends on the animal and what it's doing.
Respiration rate will vary depending on what the animal needs to be doing. If an animal has just eaten, the respiratory rate will go up because it's digesting its food. If an animal is active, it's working hard, then it will have to respire more to get more fuel to do the activity that it's doing. There's a lot of things that will cause an animal to increase its metabolic rate. Temperature is a really important one for animals whose body's temperature vary with the environment. And so if we have an animal that's at a cooler temperature, it will have a lower metabolic rate. But as the temperature increases, the metabolic rate will increase and the respiration rate will increase as well.
No matter whether the animal requires a lot of gas exchange or a little, all gas exchange depends ultimately on simple diffusion of molecules.
More oxygen is available in the environment than in the organism, so oxygen diffuses in. But there is still less inside because the animal consumes oxygen when producing energy. In the process, carbon dioxide waste is produced, so the animal has more carbon dioxide than the environment, and carbon dioxide diffuses out.
Single-cell organisms are so small that diffusion can occur across the whole cell in a very short period of time, so a special respiratory system isn't necessary. But as an animal gets larger, the distance between one part of the animal and another gets larger as well, and so at some point, the animal needs some way of making sure that oxygen can get to all parts of the body. One way to do this is to make the animal very long and very thin. But another way would be to develop a separate system for carrying oxygen to all parts of the body.
Insects are unusual in that their respiratory system carries gases directly to working cells in the body.
A row of openings along the side of the abdomen called spiracles can be held open or held closed. This is a series of tubes that branch throughout the whole body of the animal, and they branch into finer and finer and finer segments until finally they reach every single cell. And a lot of insects, if you watch them holding still, they'll actually pump the abdomen, so it's not just simply diffusion, but they're actually moving like a bellows, like when we breathe in and breathe out.
Unlike insects, most multicellular animals are large enough to require specialized respiratory surfaces that exchange gases with blood. Then blood carries the gases to and from the body's cells. When the organism lives in the water, these surfaces are referred to as gills.
In many cases, what we're calling gills is just an elaboration of the skin surface. The way the gill works is by being in close contact with the water and by having a large enough surface area and by having a very good blood supply. Typically, gills have to work by continually moving in the water, either moving the water over them or moving them through the water so that diffusion can occur. Some of the challenges of breathing water are that water doesn't hold a lot of oxygen in the first place. It holds maybe 30 times less oxygen than air does, and seawater holds even less than fresh water does. So just getting the oxygen out of the water requires moving a lot of water across the respiratory surface. Another problem is that water is heavy, it's dense, and so moving water across the gills as the animal swims or as the animal sits still in the water requires a lot of energy, and it's estimated that fish use probably 5 to 10% of their resting energy use is just for running the respiratory pump, just for pumping water across their gills. That's kind of a large investment just to breathe.
Although oxygen is more plentiful in air than in water, there are different problems associated with breathing air.
The biggest challenge of breathing air is that the gas exchange surface has to be kept moist. And when you come out in the air and there's wind and it's very dry, then the gas exchange surface is not going to be able to stay moist. What we find is that most animals that breathe air have to enclose the gas exchange surface into a lung inside the body. Otherwise, it's not effective. It gets dry, it gets hard, the animal can't use it.
It is this difference between breathing water and breathing air that has led Dr. Martin to study some of the unique organisms that frequent the intertidal zone.
A tide pool, when there's a high tide, usually has lots of oxygen for a couple of reasons. One is that there's lots of waves you can hear. Waves bring in lots of oxygen, but at a low tide, and especially at night, the pool will be very small compared to the size of the ocean. And at that time, all the animals in the pool will continue to breathe, will continue to take up oxygen and give off CO2. This is what we think probably is the selection pressure that led these fish and some of the other animals in tide pools to learn how to breathe air, to get out of the water and start breathing air, because there was very little oxygen left when everybody was breathing it at night during these low tides. The specific fish that I'm interested in, the sculpin, doesn't have a specialized air-breathing organ like a lungfish might have. This fish only has the organs that it breathes water with, that it uses also in air.
Oh, here we go. Just when you take it out of water, it doesn't act like this is a big problem for it. It doesn't get all excited or start flopping around or anything like that. It's very calm.
Up to do respirometry in both water and in air. I have a system which keeps the animal at a constant temperature because temperature affects metabolic rate, and I have it humidified air, and then we measure the exact concentrations of oxygen and carbon dioxide in that airstream.
This is oxygen, this is carbon dioxide, and we're trying to get just a measurement of how much oxygen the fish is using.
It uses its gills, it uses its skin, and it probably uses the lining of its mouth, just inside of the mouth. The reason it can use all of these surfaces is because they're relatively large surfaces, and they have a good blood supply, very close to the skin, very close to the outside of the animal, and they're kept moist by the fish all of the time. There are actually a lot of fish that use their skin for part of their respiratory work. Generally, it's a fairly small amount, maybe as low as 5%, but sometimes it can be much higher, up to 50% in some fish. The ones that use their skin more usually have a smoother skin, no scales or a very thin line of scales along their skin.
Whether by using simple diffusion or specialized transport systems, whether using body surfaces, gills, or lungs for exchange, they must all adjust their gas exchange rate, that is, how fast they breathe. How fast and how often an organism makes such adjustments depends on variations in the environment and in the organism's activity level. DJ Peterson is training for a triathlon, a grueling 3-event race.
For training, I do 3 different events: swimming, biking, and running. For swimming, I might swim 3 times a week, 2,500 meters each time. I like to run twice a week, about 5 miles each time, and then I bike 3 or 4 times a week.
Not only must he train his muscles, he must also condition his respiratory and circulatory systems in order to successfully complete this arduous race.
And start to breathe normally.
To determine his optimum training program, DJ enlisted the help of Dr. Christopher Cooper.
Go, 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 go.
During maximal exercise, human muscles could require 20 times more oxygen than at rest and produce 25 times more carbon dioxide. So our body has to respond to these increased needs.
Whether we are engaged in strenuous exercise or are at rest, our survival depends on the respiratory system's ability to obtain oxygen from our environment and remove carbon dioxide waste.
When we inhale air, it passes through the nose and mouth, and these serve to warm and humidify the air.
Next, air travels down the trachea or windpipe to a moist set of branching tubes called bronchi. Here, mucus traps dust and other particles, and beating cilia remove debris. Finally, warmed, cleansed, humidified air reaches the thin, sponge-like exchange surface, the alveoli.
The air that we breathe in mixes with air already in the alveoli, and then it is ready to give up oxygen to the blood and to take carbon dioxide from the blood to be eventually exhaled with the next breath out. Breathing is the cyclical movement of air in and out of the lungs. We breathe by contracting our respiratory muscles, and the most important muscle of inspiration is the diaphragm.
Good, you hit 60 perfectly, first time.
Like other body muscles, the respiratory muscles of the diaphragm and chest wall can be trained to work more efficiently.
The maximum oxygen uptake is important to athletes because it determines how much external work we can perform.
For the muscles to perform efficiently, oxygen must be transported quickly from the alveoli of the lungs to the cells that use it. This is the role of the blood.
Oxygen passes into the blood by diffusion. It is at first dissolved and then it combines with hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein which is contained in red blood cells, and each molecule of hemoglobin has 4 iron molecules, which are able to bind oxygen molecules. So 1 molecule of hemoglobin can bind 4 molecules of oxygen.
99% of all oxygen transported is attached to hemoglobin inside red blood cells. Well-conditioned athletes can transport oxygen better than most of us because their cardiovascular systems perform more efficiently. Their systems can distribute more blood, thus more oxygen to their tissues. In turn, the muscles become more efficient at extracting oxygen from the blood.
The capillary network is increased. There are increases in oxidative enzymes in muscles, and there are also increases in the number of mitochondria. All of these changes can be seen in an athlete with physical training, and what they represent is a greater ability to extract and utilize oxygen. When our tissues metabolize, they use fuels like carbohydrate or fat. They combust these fuels with oxygen, and in doing so, carbon dioxide is produced. We need to eliminate this carbon dioxide from the body, and we do that by transporting it in the blood to the lungs and then exhaling it in the air that we breathe out.
From tissues, carbon dioxide diffuses into blood where a small amount of it dissolves. The remaining molecules enter the red blood cells where they combine with water and eventually convert to hydrogen and bicarbonate ions. An enzyme found only inside red blood cells speeds up the reaction 250 times. The ions formed during this reaction can dissolve more easily than carbon dioxide itself. These ions make it possible to transport large amounts of the gas in this bicarbonate form. At the lung, the bicarbonate reaction is reversed. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of blood and through the moist walls of the alveoli where exhaling removes it.
Within limits, our respiratory system can adjust the breathing rate in response to our activity level. This in turn regulates carbon dioxide and oxygen within our blood.
There are several mechanisms that regulate breathing. The most important is through sensing the appropriate chemical composition of blood. But certainly it is impressive how the ventilation increases appropriately with the increase in carbon dioxide production in the body, so that the blood carbon dioxide level is actually precisely regulated during exercise.
As effective as this system is, it is possible to exceed the ability of our respiratory and circulatory systems to cope under physical stress.
Another 30 seconds, another 30 turns.
At the beginning of the test, I didn't feel anything, and then very gradually, the pressure on the wheel started to increase, and I started to feel the stress in my legs. My thighs started to burn a little bit as they got more fatigued.
Raise your hand when you want to stop. Okay.
I couldn't get enough air in, and I was breathing as hard as I could, and then all of a sudden, my energy just gave out at the last minute.
Aerobic metabolism, which uses oxygen, is 18 times more efficient than anaerobic metabolism at generating essential energy compounds like ATP. When the respiratory and circulatory systems can't deliver enough oxygen for energy needs, the working cells must switch to anaerobic metabolism for ATP production, which uses no oxygen and produces damaging waste molecules like lactic acid.
Lactic acid accumulation is an inevitable consequence of exercise above the anaerobic threshold. The anaerobic threshold is that point at submaximal exercise at which we stop, and it's a level of exercise below which we could exercise more or less indefinitely, but above which we would eventually have to stop because of lactic acid accumulation.
Actually, I am going to redesign my program. I'm going to make many of my workouts much easier, because what I found is that I was depleting my oxygen in my blood too quickly and getting tired.
By understanding his body's capabilities, DJ Peterson is training more effectively and stretching his limits. From time to time, all organisms must stretch their limits, whether in search of a personal record or in search of food. In Antarctica, marine animals find food deep in the frigid ocean under the sea ice. In order to find enough food, Weddell seals can dive deeper than 700 meters. They can also breath hold over 90 minutes. Emperor penguins dive as deep as 530 meters and hold their breath up to 22 minutes. These animals are highly adapted to their environment.
The way we work in Antarctica on our physiological studies is to find a plate of sea ice where there's no cracks or holes around in it. First, there's a clearing of the snow to give us a level base, but the large auger that is drilling the hole is 4 feet in diameter, and that hole is to accommodate a under ice observation chamber that will be placed next to the diving hole of the animal, where we can make considerable underwater observations as well as monitoring them with micro monitors that we've placed on the animals. Specializations of both diving birds and mammals are many, and these range from the variations in the respiratory system to variations in overall body forms. And they have to deal internally with a system where they're breathing intermittently and then breath holding and then exposed to pressure. The purposes of the measurements at the ice hole were to measure metabolic rate or oxygen consumption. Measuring oxygen is an extremely important variable to obtain. It's essentially the currency of nature, you might say. In other words, we have a certain O2 store in our bodies that's cached, and we can draw on that up to a limit. And that's one of the main things we wanted to find out in an effort to get some idea of how these animals dive so long. There's different places that you can store oxygen in the body. And in the case of seals, their major oxygen store is in the blood. The blood volume of a seal is about double that of a man or a woman.
Seals not only have more blood, they also carry more hemoglobin, the all-important oxygen-carrying protein. Additionally, there is a greater volume of red blood cells to contain the pigment. Each red blood cell holds 1.5 times more hemoglobin than human cells. This considerably increases the oxygen stored in the animal's blood.
Another compartment where marine mammals store oxygen is in the muscle, and they've increased their myoglobin concentrations, which is the oxygen holding or carrying pigment of the muscle, by anywhere from 5 to 10 times over that of a terrestrial mammal.
Because oxygen binds to myoglobin more tightly than to hemoglobin, its increased presence draws even more oxygen from the blood to the hard-working muscle where it is stored for use. In turn, this leaves hemoglobin free to trap more oxygen from air. Both pigments work together to increase oxygen stores 3 to 4 times that of humans.
When a marine mammal dives, there's a third compartment as far as oxygen store is concerned. I've mentioned the two, the blood and the muscle. The third is the respiratory system, or the lungs. And when the animal dives, to our surprise, it's not the same as what we do. When we dive, we inhale to a maximum lung volume before we go under to enhance that oxygen store. When a marine mammal dives, or at least when seals dive, they exhale down to 50% of their lung volume. The lung O2 store represents about 5% of the total body O2 store. The lung is that organ that is distorted the most when an animal dives because it's gas, and when it's compressed, it changes its volume considerably. The lung is a better store of nitrogen than it is of oxygen. It contains about 80% nitrogen and 20% oxygen. And the nitrogen is a liability for the animals. And if they absorb very much of it, there's two things that they could experience fairly early on. One is nitrogen narcosis, and the other one is an absorption of nitrogen, which will form gas bubbles when they return to the surface, and hence they could get decompression sickness.
Weddell seals dive on exhale. This can allow their lungs to collapse at shallow depth, moving air away from the alveoli, preventing gas exchange in the lung.
The respiratory volume that the birds dive with is much larger than it is in mammals, and it appears that birds dive on inspiration. So it means that birds would seem to be more susceptible to nitrogen narcosis and bends. In birds, the lung is the smallest part of the respiratory system in terms of volume. It's a flow-through system rather than a cul-de-sac flow in and out system. And so that most of the air is in the air sacs of birds. Because of this really different structure, we can't assume that the effects of pressure, especially on birds, are the same as they are on mammals.
In addition to storing oxygen, diving animals must cope with the continuing production of carbon dioxide and byproducts such as lactic acid. Their body's ability to store carbon dioxide is much greater than it is for the storage of oxygen, making them better adapted than terrestrial animals for the increased acidity in their blood.
We will collect blood samples for analyzing the concentration of lactic acid, an important product of anaerobic metabolism. Now, in diving mammals, most of the lactic acid is produced in the muscle, and it's actually stored in the muscle until the animal comes to the surface. Very little of it starts spilling into the blood until the time when the animal is breathing again, and then it can process it in an effective way.
So how is it that these animals hold their breath for so long? The answer is a miracle in design. Not only do they have increased oxygen stores, they can store and eliminate metabolic wastes. So although the physiology of the seals and penguins is different, they share a common need for the breath of life. Breathing is an act that ties creatures together at a very basic level. Nature reveals its beauty in both the complexity and diversity of life, seeking to sustain itself in a variety of environments.